February 2nd, 1943. The frozen wasteland outside Stalingrad. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann pressed his skeletal fingers against the pages of his diary, the pencil barely visible in his trembling grip. The words came slowly, each letter a monumental effort from a man who had not eaten a proper meal in weeks. "We are no longer soldiers," he wrote, his breath forming crystals in the -30-degree air. "We are ghosts waiting to die." Around him, the remnants of the German Sixth Army huddled in makeshift shelters carved from the frozen earth, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had once been strong young men. The sound that filled the air was not the crack of rifles or the thunder of artillery, but something far more haunting: the quiet moaning of 91,000 dying soldiers who would soon disappear into the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, never to be seen again. The Battle of Stalingrad had begun 6 months earlier as Operation Blue, Hitler's ambitious summer offensive of 1942 designed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and the strategic city bearing Stalin's name. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, had approached the city in August 1942 with approximately 364,000 soldiers, a force that represented the cream of the Wehrmacht, battle-hardened veterans who had swept across Europe in a series of lightning victories. These men carried with them the confidence of conquerors, the certainty that they were part of an unstoppable military machine that would deliver the Soviet Union its final crushing defeat. The propaganda ministry had assured them that Stalingrad would fall within weeks, that the Bolshevik resistance was crumbling, and that they would be home for Christmas with tales of another glorious victory for the fatherland. By November 1942, the German forces had fought their way into the city itself, engaging in brutal house-to-house combat that reduced Stalingrad to a moonscape of rubble and twisted metal. The soldiers wrote letters home describing their progress, confident that victory was within reach. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Hoffmann noted in his diary on September 1st, "We have fought for 15 days for a single house. The front is a corridor between burnt-out rooms. It is the thin ceiling between 2 floors." Yet even as they advanced, something was changing. The Soviet resistance was not collapsing as expected. Instead, it was hardening into something the Germans had never encountered, a defense that seemed to draw strength from the very destruction being inflicted upon it. The transformation from hunters to hunted began on November 19, 1942, when the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that would encircle the entire Sixth Army in what military historians would later call the Kessel, the cauldron. Within 4 days, 364,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles wide and 20 miles deep, cut off from all supply lines and facing the onset of one of the harshest winters in Russian history. The men who had marched confidently towards Stalingrad just months before now found themselves staring into an abyss that would consume nearly all of them. Obergefreiter Hans Diebold, a veteran of the French campaign, wrote to his wife on November 26th, "The situation has become very serious. We are completely encircled. The Führer has promised that the Luftwaffe will supply us, but the planes that do get through bring only a fraction of what we need. The promised airlift, which required a minimum of 500 to 750 tons of supplies per day to sustain the trapped army, managed to deliver an average of only 116 tons daily. The mathematics of survival became brutally simple. There was not enough food, ammunition, or medical supplies to keep 364,000 men alive through a Russian winter." As December turned to January, the physical deterioration of the Sixth Army accelerated beyond anything the German military had previously experienced. Dr. Ottmar Kohler, a top German cardiologist who flew into the pocket to investigate the alarming death rate, conducted post-mortems on soldiers who had simply collapsed and died without apparent cause. His findings were horrifying. The men were skin and bone with shrunken organs whose hearts just stopped. The human body, pushed beyond its limits by starvation, cold, and exhaustion, was simply shutting down. Soldiers who had once been the pride of the Wehrmacht now resembled walking skeletons, their uniforms hanging like shrouds on frames that barely qualified as human. The diary entries from this period paint a picture of hell on earth. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, whose earlier entries had been filled with confidence, now wrote with the detached observation of a man watching his own death approach. "The horses have already been eaten. I would eat a cat. They say its meat is also tasty. The soldiers look like corpses or lunatics, looking for something to put in their mouths. They no longer take cover from Russian shells. They haven't the strength to walk, run away and hide." The transformation was not merely physical, but psychological. Men who had been trained to fight and die for the fatherland now found themselves abandoned by that same fatherland, left to starve in a frozen wasteland, while their leaders spoke of honor and sacrifice from the comfort of heated bunkers hundreds of miles away. The final collapse came in late January 1943, when the Red Army launched its final offensive against the shrinking German pocket. By this time, the Sixth Army existed more in name than in reality, a collection of starving, frost-bitten men who could barely hold their weapons, let alone mount an effective defense. On January 31st, Field Marshal Paulus, recently promoted by Hitler in a cynical gesture designed to prevent surrender — no German field marshal had ever surrendered — made the decision that would save the lives of the remaining 91,000 men under his command. He surrendered the southern pocket of the Sixth Army to the Red Army, followed 2 days later by the surrender of the northern pocket. The men who marched into Soviet captivity on February 2, 1943, were already what one observer called the walking dead. Lieutenant Heinrich Gerlach, who would later write one of the most haunting accounts of the Stalingrad experience, described the surrender. "We were no longer human beings in any real sense. We were scarecrows, animated by nothing more than the basic instinct to survive another hour, another day." These 91,000 survivors represented less than a quarter of the force that had entered the Stalingrad cauldron just 2 months earlier. The rest, over 270,000 men, lay frozen in the snow, victims of starvation, disease, and the brutal mathematics of siege warfare. The march into captivity began immediately, with Soviet guards herding the German prisoners into long columns that stretched for miles across the frozen steppe. Those who could not keep pace were beaten with rifle butts or simply left to die in the snow. The prisoners, already weakened beyond endurance, now faced a journey that would claim thousands more lives before they ever reached a prison camp. Obergefreiter Kurt Reuber, a pastor and artist who had created the famous Stalingrad Madonna drawing during the siege, wrote in his final letter home, "We are walking into the unknown, and I fear that most of us will never see Germany again." The transportation of the Stalingrad prisoners became a logistical nightmare that revealed the brutal indifference of the Soviet system to human suffering. Trains designed to carry freight were packed with German prisoners, sometimes 200 men crammed into a single cattle car with no heat, minimal food, and no sanitation facilities. One train transporting thousands of Germans from the Volga region to Uzbekistan became a rolling charnel house, with prisoners killing each other for scraps of bread and dying by the dozens from typhoid, dysentery, and starvation. When the train finally reached its destination after weeks of travel, nearly half of its human cargo was dead. Another transport bound for the Pamir Mountains in Central Asia arrived with similar results. Boxcars filled with corpses and a handful of survivors who were more dead than alive. The Soviet guards, themselves often poorly supplied and operating under orders that classified German prisoners as fascist criminals rather than prisoners of war entitled to protection under international law, showed little concern for the mounting death toll. The attitude was summed up by one Soviet officer who reportedly told a group of German prisoners, "You came here to destroy us. Now you will learn what destruction means." The camps themselves were scattered across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of Central Asia. The German Sixth Army, once a cohesive fighting force, was deliberately dispersed to more than 20 different camps, ensuring that no significant group of prisoners could maintain unit cohesion or organize resistance. In the holding areas near Stalingrad, prisoners were crammed shoulder to shoulder in dugouts barely large enough for a dozen men, forced to sleep standing up in shifts while the temperature outside dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Food, when it was available, consisted of a daily ration that would have been inadequate for a sedentary civilian, let alone men who were expected to perform hard labor. The standard meal was a piece of hard, frozen bread, often mixed with sawdust to increase bulk, and a thin soup made from rotten potatoes and whatever scraps of meat could be found. Obergefreiter Franz Siebeler, one of the few Stalingrad veterans who would eventually return to Germany, later wrote, "We learned to eat things that would have made us vomit in our former lives. Grass, bark, leather from our boots, anything that might contain a calorie became precious beyond gold." The psychological impact of this systematic dehumanization was perhaps even more devastating than the physical suffering. Men who had been raised to believe in the superiority of German culture and military prowess now found themselves reduced to the level of animals, fighting over scraps of food and dying in their own filth. The carefully constructed worldview that had sustained them through years of war collapsed under the weight of their reality. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, whose diary had chronicled the entire Stalingrad experience, made his final entry in March 1943. "I no longer believe in anything. Not in victory, not in the fatherland, not in God. I believe only in death, which comes for us all." Disease became the greatest killer in the camps, with typhoid sweeping through the prisoner populations like wildfire. The Soviet medical system, already strained by the demands of total war, had neither the resources nor the inclination to provide adequate care for German prisoners. In the 3 months between February and April 1943, an estimated 400,000 Axis prisoners, Germans, Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians, died in Soviet captivity, most from starvation and disease. The death rate was so high that the camps could not process the bodies fast enough, leading to mass graves that were often nothing more than pits in the frozen ground. The breakdown of human civilization in the camps reached its nadir with the emergence of cannibalism among the prisoners. Starving men, driven beyond the boundaries of sanity by hunger, began to prey upon their weaker comrades. The situation became so severe that camp commanders were forced to organize anti-cannibal squads composed of German officers armed with crowbars and clubs, tasked with hunting down and stopping these desperate acts of survival. Obergefreiter Heinrich Gerlach later wrote, "We had become something less than human, something that our mothers would not have recognized. The war had taken everything from us, our strength, our hope, our humanity itself." The few prisoners who were kept in Stalingrad itself to aid in the city's reconstruction faced their own unique horrors. The city they were forced to rebuild was the same city they had spent months trying to destroy, and the irony was not lost on them. Working 12-hour shifts in sub-zero temperatures, often without proper tools or adequate food, they cleared rubble from streets they had once fought to control and rebuilt buildings they had once reduced to ruins. Many of these men died from typhus and exhaustion. Their bodies simply added to the countless graves that marked the Stalingrad battlefield. Neither the Germans nor the Soviets understood the medical concept of refeeding syndrome, the dangerous metabolic changes that occur when nutrition is reintroduced to severely malnourished individuals. This ignorance meant that even when food became more available, many prisoners died from the shock of eating after months of starvation. Their bodies, adapted to near-starvation conditions, could not process normal amounts of food, leading to cardiac arrest and organ failure. Dr. Hans Diebold, a German military physician who survived captivity, later estimated that proper medical knowledge could have saved thousands of lives. But such knowledge was either unavailable or ignored in the brutal calculus of the Soviet camp system. The years that followed brought little relief for the surviving prisoners. While the war ended in May 1945, the Soviet Union continued to hold German prisoners as a form of reparations labor, using them to rebuild the infrastructure that the German invasion had destroyed. The legal justification was that these men were not prisoners of war, but war criminals who had participated in an aggressive war against the Soviet Union. This classification allowed the Soviets to ignore international law regarding the treatment and repatriation of prisoners, keeping German soldiers in captivity for years after the war's end. The psychological impact of this extended captivity was devastating for men who had expected to return home after Germany's surrender. Letters from home, when they were allowed, brought news of a Germany that no longer existed, cities destroyed by Allied bombing, families scattered or dead, and a homeland divided between occupying powers. Many prisoners began to question whether they had anything to return to, whether the Germany they had fought for still existed in any meaningful sense. Field Marshal Paulus himself experienced a very different fate from his men. After his surrender, he was treated as what the Soviets termed a guest rather than a prisoner of war. His living conditions, while not luxurious, were far superior to those of ordinary Soviet citizens, let alone German prisoners. He was housed in comfortable quarters, provided with adequate food and medical care, and even allowed to participate in Soviet propaganda efforts against the Nazi regime. This preferential treatment was part of a calculated Soviet strategy to use high-ranking German officers as symbols of Nazi defeat and as tools for influencing German public opinion. Paulus's transformation from German field marshal to Soviet propaganda asset was gradual but complete. By 1944, he was making radio broadcasts calling on German soldiers to surrender and denouncing the Nazi leadership that had abandoned his army at Stalingrad. His participation in the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German prisoners and exiles, marked his complete break with his former allegiances. When he finally returned to Germany in 1953, after Stalin's death, he settled in East Germany, where he lived quietly until his death in 1957, a broken man who had outlived most of his soldiers by more than a decade. The repatriation of the surviving Stalingrad prisoners became a major diplomatic issue in the 1950s, as West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer made their release a priority in his negotiations with the Soviet Union. The Soviets initially claimed that they held no prisoners of war, only convicted war criminals who had been sentenced by Soviet courts for their crimes against the Soviet people. This fiction was maintained until 1955, when Adenauer traveled to Moscow for direct negotiations with Soviet leaders Nikolai Bulganin and Nikita Khrushchev. The final release came in September 1955, more than 12 years after the Battle of Stalingrad had ended. Of the 91,000 men who had marched into Soviet captivity in February 1943, fewer than 6,000 returned to Germany. The trains that brought them home carried men who were shadows of their former selves, prematurely aged, physically broken, and psychologically scarred by experiences that defied description. Many had been teenagers when they were captured. They returned as middle-aged men who had spent their entire adult lives in Soviet captivity. The homecoming was bittersweet for these survivors. The Germany they returned to was a divided nation, still occupied by foreign powers and struggling to come to terms with the magnitude of its defeat and the crimes committed in its name. Many of the returning prisoners found that their families had given them up for dead years earlier, that their wives had remarried, and that their children did not recognize them. The psychological adjustment to freedom after more than a decade of captivity proved almost as difficult as the captivity itself. The medical examinations conducted on the returning prisoners revealed the full extent of their suffering. Most showed signs of chronic malnutrition, with stunted growth in those who had been captured as teenagers. Dental problems were universal, as were various forms of psychological trauma that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Many suffered from what doctors termed barbed wire disease, a form of institutionalization that made it difficult for them to function in normal society after years of regimented camp life. The stories these men brought back with them provided the first detailed accounts of the fate of the Stalingrad prisoners, filling in the gaps in a tragedy that had been shrouded in Soviet secrecy for more than a decade. Their testimonies revealed not just the physical horrors of captivity, but the systematic destruction of human dignity that had characterized the Soviet treatment of German prisoners. These accounts would later become crucial historical documents, providing insight into one of the war's most devastating episodes. The broader implications of the Stalingrad prisoner tragedy extended far beyond the immediate suffering of the men involved. The loss of 85,000 prisoners represented not just a military disaster, but a demographic catastrophe for Germany. These were men in their prime, skilled workers and professionals who would have contributed to Germany's post-war reconstruction. Their absence was felt in countless German communities for generations, as families waited in vain for fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return. The psychological impact on German society was equally profound. The fate of the Stalingrad prisoners became a symbol of the war's ultimate futility, a reminder that the promises of glory and victory had led only to death and suffering on an unimaginable scale. The knowledge that so many German soldiers had died not in battle but in Soviet camps, abandoned by their own leadership and forgotten by their homeland, contributed to a deep sense of national guilt and trauma that would influence German political culture for decades to come. The Soviet treatment of German prisoners also had lasting implications for Cold War relations. The deliberate prolonging of captivity well beyond the war's end the use of prisoners as forced labor, and the high mortality rates in Soviet camps became powerful propaganda tools for the Western Allies in their ideological struggle against communism. The image of German soldiers dying in Soviet gulags served to reinforce Western narratives about the brutality of the Soviet system and the fundamental incompatibility between communist and democratic values. Within the Soviet Union itself, the handling of German prisoners reflected broader patterns of state violence and disregard for human life that characterized Stalin's regime. The same bureaucratic machinery that had orchestrated the deaths of millions of Soviet citizens during collectivization and the purges was applied to German prisoners with predictable results. The camps that held German prisoners were often the same facilities that had housed Soviet political prisoners, operated by the same personnel using the same methods of control and intimidation. The documentation of the Stalingrad prisoner tragedy also revealed the extent to which both German and Soviet authorities had failed to prepare for the massive numbers of prisoners that the Eastern Front would generate. The German military had made no serious plans for the possibility of large-scale surrender, while the Soviet system, despite its experience with mass incarceration, was overwhelmed by the sudden influx of foreign prisoners. This mutual unpreparedness contributed significantly to the high mortality rates, as neither side had the infrastructure or resources necessary to maintain large prisoner populations under wartime conditions. The individual stories of survival among the Stalingrad prisoners provide glimpses of human resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, whose diary had chronicled the descent into hell at Stalingrad, somehow survived the camps and returned to Germany in 1955. His post-war writings revealed a man fundamentally changed by his experiences, no longer the confident young soldier who had marched toward Stalingrad, but a haunted survivor who struggled to find meaning in his suffering. His account of watching friends die of starvation while Soviet guards remained indifferent became one of the most powerful testimonies to emerge from the camps. Dr. Hans Diebold, the military physician who had documented the medical horrors of the siege, used his medical knowledge to help fellow prisoners survive the camps. His clandestine efforts to treat sick prisoners with improvised medicines and his organization of sanitation efforts in the camps saved countless lives. His post-war medical reports on the effects of prolonged starvation and exposure became important contributions to medical literature, helping doctors understand and treat similar conditions in future conflicts. Lieutenant Heinrich Gerlach, who had written some of the most haunting descriptions of the Stalingrad experience, channeled his survival into literary achievement. His novel, The Forsaken Army, written in secret during his captivity and smuggled out of the Soviet Union, became one of the most powerful anti-war novels of the 20th century. His ability to transform personal trauma into artistic expression provided a model for other survivors struggling to make sense of their experiences. The fate of the Stalingrad prisoners also highlighted the broader question of war crimes and accountability that would dominate post-war international relations. While the Nuremberg trials focused primarily on the crimes committed by Nazi leaders and organizations, the treatment of German prisoners in Soviet camps raised uncomfortable questions about Allied conduct during and after the war. The deliberate starvation of prisoners, the use of forced labor, and the denial of repatriation rights all violated international law, yet these crimes were never prosecuted or officially acknowledged. This selective application of justice contributed to a sense among many Germans that they were being held to different standards than their former enemies. The knowledge that German war crimes were being prosecuted while Soviet crimes against German prisoners were ignored created a narrative of victimization that would influence German political discourse for decades. This sense of injustice was particularly acute among the families of the missing Stalingrad prisoners, who felt that their loved ones had been forgotten by both their enemies and their own government. The long-term medical consequences of captivity continued to affect the survivors for the rest of their lives. Studies conducted decades after their return revealed elevated rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and various forms of cancer among former prisoners. The chronic malnutrition they had endured appeared to have permanent effects on their metabolism and immune systems, making them more susceptible to age-related diseases. Many died prematurely, their lifespans shortened by the years of abuse they had endured in Soviet camps. The psychological effects were equally persistent. Many survivors suffered from what would now be recognized as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, characterized by nightmares, flashbacks, and an inability to form normal relationships. The shame associated with survival, the feeling that they had somehow failed their dead comrades by living when so many had died, created additional layers of psychological trauma. Support groups for former prisoners became important sources of healing, as men who had shared the experience of captivity found solace in each other's company. The children and grandchildren of Stalingrad survivors also bore the psychological burden of their ancestors' experiences. Many grew up in households marked by silence about the war, where fathers and grandfathers refused to discuss their experiences or did so only in fragments that left more questions than answers. This intergenerational transmission of trauma became a subject of psychological study, as researchers sought to understand how the effects of extreme experiences could be passed down through families. The political implications of the Stalingrad prisoner tragedy extended into the Cold War era and beyond. In East Germany, the communist government used the suffering of German prisoners in Soviet camps as evidence of the need for socialist solidarity and the dangers of Western militarism. The narrative was carefully crafted to blame the prisoners' fate on Nazi aggression while absolving the Soviet Union of responsibility for their treatment. This official version of events was challenged by the testimonies of returning prisoners, creating tensions within East German society that would persist until reunification. In West Germany, the fate of the Stalingrad prisoners became part of a broader narrative about German victimization during and after the war. Conservative politicians used the prisoners' suffering to argue for German rearmament and integration into Western defense structures, claiming that only strength could prevent future German soldiers from suffering similar fates. This politicization of the prisoners' memory sometimes obscured the broader lessons of their experience, reducing complex questions of war and morality to simple narratives of good and evil. The Soviet archives, opened after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, provided new insights into the decision-making processes that had determined the fate of German prisoners. Documents revealed that the high mortality rates were not simply the result of wartime chaos, but reflected deliberate policies designed to extract maximum labor value from prisoners while minimizing the resources devoted to their care. The classification of German prisoners as war criminals rather than prisoners of war was shown to be a calculated decision that allowed Soviet authorities to ignore international law with impunity. These revelations sparked new debates about historical responsibility and the nature of war crimes. Russian historians and politicians, faced with evidence of systematic mistreatment of German prisoners, often responded by pointing to German atrocities on Soviet soil, creating a cycle of moral equivalence that obscured the specific nature of each set of crimes. The difficulty of achieving historical reconciliation between former enemies became apparent as each side struggled to acknowledge its own crimes while maintaining narratives of victimization. The modern legacy of the Stalingrad prisoners continues to influence contemporary politics and historical memory. In Russia, any attempt to discuss the suffering of German prisoners is often met with accusations of Nazi apologism, as demonstrated by the case of high school student Nikolai Desyatnichenko, who was investigated under Russia's rehabilitation of Nazism laws simply for writing about the discovery of a German soldier's remains. This legal framework makes honest historical discussion nearly impossible, perpetuating cycles of ignorance and resentment that undermine efforts at reconciliation. The story of the missing Stalingrad prisoners serves as a powerful reminder of war's capacity to destroy not just armies and cities, but the fundamental bonds of human civilization. The transformation of 91,000 soldiers from warriors to victims, from human beings to statistics, illustrates how quickly the veneer of civilization can be stripped away under extreme conditions. Their fate demonstrates that in total war, the distinction between combatant and victim often becomes meaningless, as political decisions made in distant capitals determine who lives and who dies with a randomness that mocks human pretensions to justice and order. The mathematical precision of their destruction, 91,000 captured, 85,000 dead, reduces individual human tragedies to abstract numbers that fail to capture the magnitude of suffering involved. Behind each statistic was a man with hopes, fears, family, and dreams, reduced to a name on a list or a body in an unmarked grave. The bureaucratic efficiency with which their deaths were recorded and forgotten speaks to the capacity of modern states to organize suffering on an industrial scale, treating human beings as expendable resources in pursuit of political objectives. The silence that surrounded their fate for more than a decade after the war's end reflects the broader tendency of societies to forget inconvenient truths that complicate preferred narratives of victory and defeat. The German government's failure to secure their release earlier, the Soviet Union's denial of their existence, and the international community's indifference to their plight all demonstrate how easily the powerless can be abandoned when their suffering serves no political purpose. Yet the story of the Stalingrad prisoners also reveals the persistence of human dignity even under the most dehumanizing conditions. The doctors who continued to treat patients without medicine, the officers who maintained discipline without authority, and the ordinary soldiers who shared their meager rations with weaker comrades all demonstrated that moral choice remains possible even when survival itself is in doubt. Their examples provide hope that human decency can survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. The few who returned carried with them not just the memory of their own suffering, but the responsibility to bear witness for those who had died. Their testimonies, painful as they were to give and to hear, served as a form of resurrection for the dead, ensuring that their sacrifice would not be entirely forgotten. In a world that preferred to move on from uncomfortable truths, these survivors insisted on the importance of memory, on the obligation to acknowledge suffering even when it served no political purpose. The ultimate lesson of the missing Stalingrad prisoners may be that the true cost of war cannot be measured in strategic objectives achieved or territories conquered, but in the individual human lives destroyed in pursuit of abstract political goals. Their fate serves as a warning about the ease with which civilized societies can slide into barbarism when ideology overrides humanity, when political necessity justifies any level of suffering, and when the powerful forget their obligations to the powerless. As the last survivors of Stalingrad pass away and their experiences fade from living memory, the responsibility for preserving their story falls to historians and citizens who never experienced such extremes of human cruelty and endurance. The challenge is to honor their memory without exploiting their suffering, to learn from their experience without trivializing their pain, and to ensure that future generations understand both the fragility of civilization and the resilience of the human spirit when confronted with its collapse. The empty spaces at German dinner tables, the letters that were never answered, and the families that waited in vain for men who would never return home represent the true legacy of the missing Stalingrad prisoners. Their absence echoes through generations, a reminder that the consequences of political decisions extend far beyond the leaders who make them to touch the lives of ordinary people who have no voice in determining their fate. In remembering them, we honor not just their sacrifice, but our obligation to ensure that such tragedies are never repeated, that the lessons learned from their suffering serve to build a more humane world for those who come after.